So good afternoon, everyone. We will be talking about demographic changes. It's me and my teammate Eric. And so first off on demographics, it's something that mainly hits initially policy, and afterwards, through policy, it will hit business. So it's very much a long-term effect that we're looking at. And today, when we're looking at demographics, we won't be talking about the changes in income distribution, but we'll be looking much more about people living longer and people who have less kids. And in essence, so the changes in the age composition of populations around the world. And so today we'll be talking about some of the trends that we see that are driving these changes, some of the challenges and also opportunities that come with that. And then finally we'll be looking at two cases to make it more specific on a country level, how demographics impacts both policy and the business side. If we look at demography, then especially from an age perspective, the population pyramid, which describes how the population is distributed amongst different age brackets, is the default tool. And so this is the world in 1950 with about 2.5 billion people. And here it still truly is a pyramid. If we see how that pyramid evolves over time as we go to today, we can see that people live longer. And as a result, the pyramid contracts and the bulk of the population moves up to an older age in this pyramid. Then if we look how that further develops in the next 85 years, we can see that the pyramid is no longer a pyramid. And a much larger share of the population will live longer and will be much older. And this is from a world perspective. This is not even from the perspective of Western countries. So we've looked at this and identified what we think are the four main drivers for this change in the size of the shape of the population pyramid. And so one of those is the availability of healthcare. So across the board, healthcare has become cheaper. We've developed new technologies, and also the availability of healthcare, especially in the developed world, has increased. That means that people live longer. That is one of the drivers for the change in the pyramid. The other part is the increase in safety in the world. So on average, it's much less likely that people pass away as a result of violence or violent conflicts, even though, of course, we still do have violence around the world. A third point is increasing secularization. So what we see is as people become less religious, they tend to have fewer children. And so with lower birth rates, we see again that has a big impact on how the pyramid looks. And then a fourth point is child policies. So for some countries, we've seen child policies discouraging people from having children, for example in China, and we've also seen countries where the reverse is true, where people have actually been actively stimulating people to have children. So combine these four forces, what we see is that people live longer, and at the same time people have less children. And so overall, as I said, the pyramid becomes much more of a column. Now, if we look at how countries move through these demographic changes, we see three distinct phases. The first one is expansion. That means where healthcare already goes up, and we see the bottom of the pyramid becoming quite wide, but we don't yet see, because people haven't aged through, the top of the pyramid changing. So an example of that would, for example, be Angola. And this is a burden for the country in the sense that we have a lot of new people that are not yet participating in the workforce. So these white lines here is roughly the age at which people are considered fit to work. And this is at 65 years old, what we'd see as the age where people could retire. As we move to the second phase, which is demographic bonus, we see that this big bulk of people is moving into working age, but at the same time, birth rates are already declining. So the bottom of the pyramid is getting smaller again. So here we have a situation where not that many people have retired, and we also don't have that many young people. And it means the bulk of the people are of working age. So Brazil is an example of a country that's currently having its demographic bonus. And as a result, there is a lot of production, so to say, in the country, a lot of availability of labor, and relatively low cost from a government perspective from, for example, education, health, and pensions. Then finally, as this bulk of people moves through and birth rates keep falling, you go to the situation that we see in Japan. And in Japan, you can see that people are retiring, so moving out of the workforce on the top of the pyramid, but we don't have the people to supplement them on the bottom of the pyramid. And we'll talk more about that in one of our two cases. Now, if we look at how demographic change impacts how a government could look at policy, we've taken this demographic formula, which looks more complicated than it is, but on this side has kind of the output a country can produce, which we decomposed in productivity of an employed person, how many people that are employed of those that could work, how many people out of the total population are actually considered fit to work. And on the other hand, we have kind of the cost side, so for example, healthcare, education, and pensions. Now, if I take an example on the production side, what we see, considering if everything else would stay equal, we would expect that the GDP per capita over time the growth of GDP per capita over time is decreasing, because we'll have less people in the workforce compared to the number of people that's outside of the workforce. As a government, what kind of policies could people enact? Well, there's basically two options. One is saying, well, if we have less people in the workforce, we can counter that by getting more people in the workforce. One of the options, for example, to have additional women participate in the workforce. Other options are to extend this age bracket and have people join the workforce earlier or leave the workforce later. Another option is to look at immigration. Although immigration could work for one country or a few countries, but it shifts the problem of taking the workforce from another country to your country. Now, if you could not increase the size of the labor force, another option is to say, well, then we need to increase productivity of those people that do work. And that is something that governments could stimulate through incentivizing investments, for example, in education or in capital equipment that can be used to increase productivity. On the cost side, one of the big issues that we'll be facing is pensions. So there are kind of two sorts of pension systems. One is those where you save for yourself, and one is the pay-as-you-go system, where the pension contribution I'm paying is used to pay somebody who is currently retired, or at least in part used to pay somebody who is now retired. And as the population pyramid is contracting, we'll have less people contributing to pensions, but more people that actually need the pension payments. So these systems are slowly turning in a Ponzi scheme, where we're now at this point where you could, for some European countries, argue that 40% of your salary would have to go into pension payments just to make it sustainable again. Then none of the options that we have are easy to communicate. So one of those is, again, raising retirement age, so reducing the cost of having people retired and also creating additional years where people can contribute to pensions. The other part is saying, well, perhaps we can have people contribute more in general. And a third option is to say, well, perhaps your pension will shrink and we'll expect you to have additional savings to do private funding of your retirement. Another point that is, especially now in the Western world, already becoming a problem is rising healthcare costs. As people grow older, as we can see here, especially above the age of 60, we can see that healthcare costs are increasing. And so with an aging population and a smaller population that's actually there to support these costs, rising healthcare costs are becoming a significant part of the GDP of a country. And here too, we can see two options. One is saying, well, perhaps we can reduce the amount of healthcare that people need. So one, incentivizing people to live more healthy lives. And two, perhaps make people co-pay, for example, on healthcare, in a sense that people are incentivized not to use healthcare that they might not need. The other part is on the financial side. Either we need to make healthcare cheaper, which means that we could make it perhaps more efficient, or alternatively, we should find a way to be able to pay for the current healthcare without it becoming cheaper, which could mean higher fees for health insurance or higher taxes. Now, as I said, we'll be looking at two cases, Japan and Israel, to illustrate how this how demographic change affects these two countries. I'll hand over to Eric.
Thank you, Dennis. As Dennis said, yes, we will look at two case examples, Japan and Israel. Japan is facing what you might call a perfect storm. We'll go into that and we'll find some business implications that you can derive and use perhaps in your own operations. And we'll look at Israel, which is, I think you would say it's thought of as a very homogeneous society. We'll look at some trends demographically within the country that are tearing it apart and risk destabilizing its cultural identity. We'll start with Japan. The Japanese government currently is facing two major obstacles. You see a historic birth rate decline. You see also an increase in life expectancy. These are combining with a variety of elements. We have negligible immigration for a variety of reasons. We have urbanization, we have economic stagnation that we've all read about and are pretty familiar with, and then increasing national debt. The Japanese government has found that they're not able to replace their aging workforce. They've created a variety of policies, and one really innovative strategy is that they've gone into their university structure, they've found a robot baby, and they're giving this as a subsidized healthcare therapy to young couples to stimulate the maternal and paternal instinct and increase the likelihood of bearing children. It's a very interesting theory. It's in practice now. We'll talk about why this model, this healthcare and social stabilization model, is on its head. If you look at the ratio between non-working to working populations, on the left side of the graph you see a surplus. This is an area where the model works. We're in the middle right now. On the right-hand side, the model's on its head. It's unsustainable. From a forward perspective, we'll see a population shift that starts, it'll start in the 80s. The bottom line is the bottom threshold. This is 15 years. This is considered the minimum age to start work. The top threshold is 65. Dennis alluded that we might be able to move these two, but we'll see over time how this has shifted. We start in the 80s. 2000, we have a large majority, a bulge in the middle. These are the working population. As we go to 2040, we see this bulge exiting this working bracket. This is the crux of the problem. And this is what the current government is trying to change. From a forward-looking projection standpoint, we'll see an increased debt burden. The need to increase this productive population, either through efficiencies or literal growth, will combine with rising healthcare costs, increasing complexity, shifting healthcare models, and there are a variety of sources that project the need to increase GDP of 8 to 10% to satisfy this upside-down model. This is extreme. It's highly unlikely. As we know, the Japanese economy is fairly flat at the moment, to say the least. Another lever that can be pulled is immigration. This was tried already. A large number of Japanese immigrants moved to Brazil. They were re-incentivized in the late 80s to come back. There were two problems with this. The first was the fact that Japan is an incredibly tight, closed, advanced culture. There's nothing more difficult for a re-immigrant than looking Japanese and not speaking the language. To compound this fact, shortly thereafter, there was an economic downturn. Most of these immigrants returned to Brazil. It was a failure. This is a lever that cannot be pulled. From a business standpoint, for your businesses, potentially, there are implications. Healthcare is key. Everyone hears about healthcare, but in Japan, it's acute. We have automation, digitization, a real focus on care, but not from a human perspective. Robotic is an opportunity. If you look at care models, you have an aging demographic. You have holistic family planning opportunities. Productivity levers, going back and switching out of healthcare, we could see that increased automation is a factor. Consumption shifts. We have targeted educational opportunities. We'll talk a little more about that in a moment. And then, of course, we have women in the workforce. Now, Japan is a very, very, I wouldn't say unique, but in Japan's context, women marry, tend to give birth, and then shift out of the workforce. Bringing that back in increases the population base and this productive capacity within the Japanese society. It's a very large factor. Let's shift around again. Let's go to Israel. On the top left, you'll see three bars. The ultra-Orthodox population, the Israeli Arabic population, and then the mainstream Jewish population. Now, the ultra-Orthodox population is growing at 5%. If you come down, you'll see the ultra-Orthodox and the Israeli Arabic are squeezing these mainstream Jews. This has a variety of implications in three broad categories: economic, political, social, and government policy. From an economic side, we can talk about religion. The ultra-Orthodox population does not contribute actively to the GDP. They spend the predominant amount of their time practicing religion. This adds stress to those in the workforce who are generating value. We see an increased tax pressure from these subsidies. From a political and social standpoint, we see a change in government composition. Israel is a representative democracy, and so necessarily when portions of the population shift, this will be reflected in the trajectory of the government. This causes, and could potentially cause, a loss of national identity, and certainly will cause, and is causing, an increase in tension between religious groups within the country. The current government has an innovative strategy to deal with this. They've created a variety of subsidies, enticements, to attract their target demographic, mainstream Jews. They've created a financial incentive of $5,000 US, free Hebrew courses, lower tuition, rent, mortgage subsidies, free tax benefits, a free plane ticket for all those wishing to immigrate, and I think you get a free taxi when you go from the airport to where you're going to live. There's this as well. This has combined to create a variety of opportunities for businesses. The government is trying to attract a target group. You have the basic increases in immigration. You have moving services, construction, retail, general demand factors. But from a business standpoint, it's very easy to start a business here. It's very easy because of low labor restrictions and tax incentives. There are risks. There's an increased tax burden. The system is not sustainable. There's socioeconomic unrest, religious unrest, and cultural adaptation costs. But let's go back and sum some of these ideas up and apply them on a broader context to business. From a demographic perspective, consumer demand and labor supply side provide a variety of opportunities and risks for your businesses. From a labor supply side, in opportunities, we have older and more experienced workforce. This means, in most cases, efficiency, a greater retention of knowledge, but at the same time, the need to transition this knowledge to younger generations. An increased participation of women, retired workers potentially returning to work. On the risk side, we have employee talent pipeline issues. There's a fairly known example in the US within the oil sector. Approximately 50% of petrochemical engineers are within 10 years of retirement. The pipeline has not stepped in, compounded by the fact that we've had a shock in oil prices, and the new generation is not available to replace these aging workers. From a consumer demand side, we have I think the most prominent example would be Cadillac in the US market. In 2000, the board of GM gathered. They had a problem. Cadillac was seen as an old person's car. Their market was dying, so they decided to rebrand. And now Cadillac, in the US market primarily, but also globally, competes with BMW, Audi, Mercedes at an approximately equal level, depending on which brand you prefer. Additional issues, opportunities on the consumer demand side include healthcare, chronic disease treatment, automation, we've mentioned. From a nutritional standpoint, you see shifting demographics preferring different types of nutrition, different understandings of what they're eating, and in many cases, wanting to know where this food comes from. From a risk standpoint, your markets are changing. Shrinking youth markets, aging youth markets are dynamic bodies that you have to not only respond to, but also predict, and in some cases, guide. And from a financial service standpoint, aside from the regulation that we've talked about, we could see a defunding of markets as large percentages of populations withdraw their assets and reallocate these into more retirement-friendly strategies and healthcare models. So I think with that, we could open for questions.